Imagine coming home after a long, exhausting day, keys in hand, ready to collapse onto your own couch, only to find a group of HOA board members standing on your front lawn like a pack of guard dogs. Their president points at you with a smug smile and says, "You don't live here anymore." And before you even process what she means, flashing police lights pull up behind you. The officer steps out and asks you to vacate the premises. Your house, your keys, your name on the deed. But suddenly, you're the intruder. And the HOA? They planned every second of it. Most people think danger arrives loudly, with sirens blaring or alarms screaming. But in my neighborhood, trouble moved quietly, slipping in between ordinary days like a shadow no one noticed until it was too late. At that time, my life was simple. I woke up early, tended my small front garden, greeted the same neighbors who always waved back, and drove to work without thinking twice about the home I would return to each evening. Everything felt stable, predictable, and safe, the kind of life where you never question ownership of the space you built your world around. The homeowners association was always present, but never truly intrusive. They sent monthly newsletters, mostly filled with dull reminders about lawn height, trash, schedules, and community events no one actually attended. I had disagreements with them now and then, usually over something small, like a flower pot that didn't match community standards or a harmless decorative lantern they said was too bright. Annoying, sure, but not enough to cause real concern. At least, that is what I thought. Looking back, the signs were there, tiny cracks forming around the edges, warning me that the peace I relied on was fragile. The subtle shift began with the new HOA president, a woman named Marla who carried herself like she owned the entire subdivision. She walked with her chin raised, eyes sharp, always scanning for anything she could label a violation. She thrived on rules, control, and authority, and unlike the old board, she had no interest in being friendly. She looked at my house the way someone looks at a chess piece they plan to remove from the board. Even then, I brushed it off. I thought she was just another overzealous HOA officer hungry for structure in a quiet neighborhood. But then came the surprise inspections, random visits, repeated questions about my occupancy. Strange warnings slipped into my mailbox without explanation. Marla claimed it was routine business, a new system, an improvement to community oversight. Still, something about her tone felt threatening, like each word carried a hidden meaning. Even neighbors noticed her hovering near my property more than usual. One of them joked that she was more familiar with my front lawn than her own. I laughed along, pretending it didn't bother me. But deep down, I sensed a shift, a quiet unease I couldn't quite name. Nothing prepared me for the day everything changed. But looking back, the buildup was almost obvious. The glances, the notes, the unusual meetings happening without residents. Present, the growing hostility in Marla's eyes each time she saw me. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that makes your stomach tighten even when you don't know why. I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the houses, unaware that within days I would return home and find an entire crowd waiting to tell me I no longer belonged in my own house. The shift began quietly, almost politely, as if the HOA didn't want to reveal its hand too early. It started with a note taped to my door one morning. No greeting, no signature, just a vague message stating that my property was under review for compliance issues. I stared at the words, confused, because nothing had changed about my house in months. The paint was fresh, the lawn neatly trimmed, and every rule had been followed with annoying precision. Still, something about the note felt off, like it wasn't meant to inform me but to warn me. Later that afternoon, an email arrived with almost the same message, only this time phrased more aggressively. It claimed that several concerns had been raised regarding my residency status, and that the HOA would be conducting an evaluation soon. Residency status. I had lived in this house for years. My name was on the deed, my bills, my taxes. The wording felt intentional, like they wanted to plant the idea that something about my presence here was wrong. When I replied asking for clarification, I received nothing back. No explanation, no details, just silence that felt strategic. That evening, as I walked to my mailbox, my neighbor Tom stepped out from his porch and motioned me over. He looked uneasy, like he was debating whether to speak. After a moment, he lowered his voice and said there had been a board meeting the night before. A closed-door meeting. He heard my name mentioned more than once, followed by long pauses and harsh tones. When he asked what was going on, they brushed him off. His final words lingered in my mind. I think they're planning something, and whatever it isn't good. The next day, I noticed the difference. The community pool access card I always used beeped red and denied me entry. I tried again, thinking it was a glitch, but the result was the same. The attendant shrugged and said my membership had been temporarily suspended. He didn't know why. Or maybe he did, and he simply didn't want to say. Later, the gate to the dog park refused my code, as if someone had deliberately removed my access from the system. It was subtle, quiet sabotage designed to push me out without saying a single direct word. By the third day, the atmosphere around me had shifted entirely. People who once waved at me now kept their distance, offering awkward nods and forced smiles. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, stepping aside when I approached. I didn't know if they were afraid, confused, or misinformed. But the message was clear. Something had changed in how the community saw me. Every interaction carried a weight, an invisible pressure that made me feel like a stranger standing on my own street. The whole place seemed to pulse with tension, and I could feel myself getting pulled into something I didn't understand. That by the end of the week, even the air around my home felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I sensed eyes watching from windows as I came and went. I sensed conversations stopping when I passed. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet, as if saving its energy for something bigger. And although I didn't know it yet, every note, every warning, every denied access was just the beginning. The real blow was coming soon, timed perfectly, waiting for the moment I'd walk toward my front door with my keys in hand. The day it happened felt strangely normal at first. The kind of afternoon where nothing hints at chaos waiting just around the corner. I drove home thinking only about dinner and the comforting silence of my living room. My keys sat in the cup holder beside me, glinting in the fading sunlight. A simple reminder that I was returning to a place that belonged to me and no one else. But as I turned onto my street, I noticed something was off. A cluster of cars I didn't recognize lined the curb, and a small crowd stood gathered near my driveway. At first, I thought it might be some neighborhood event or a lost pet situation, something harmless. But as I approached, the crowd shifted their attention toward me. Their expressions were a mix of discomfort and anticipation, the kind of look people give when they know something you don't. Standing at the front of them was Marla, the HOA president, arms crossed, chin raised, wearing a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. She stepped forward as I pulled into my driveway, blocking my path completely. I got out of my car slowly, unsure what I was walking into. Before I could speak, Marla announced loudly that I was trespassing on HOA-controlled property. Her voice carried across the street like a warning siren. A few neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, but no one said a word. I laughed a little, not out of humor but disbelief. I told her the property she was standing on belonged to me, and I motioned toward the house, but she didn't budge. Instead, she pulled out a clipboard thick with papers and held it like evidence. She had been waiting to present that. She informed me, in an almost rehearsed tone, that my residency had been voided, as if that were an actual legal term. I asked her to explain how she came to that conclusion, but she cut me off, insisting there had been multiple violations serious enough to justify my removal. I asked what violations she was referring to. She pointed at the papers, but refused to show them. The crowd behind her whispered, feeding the tension. Everything about the moment felt carefully staged, like she had been preparing for this confrontation long before I even realized something was wrong. I took a step toward my front door, but Marla moved in front of me again, blocking the path. With her entire body, she said I was no longer allowed to enter the house, that the HOA had regained control of the property until further notice. The absurdity of her words hit me hard. Regained control. This was my home, bought with my money under my name, my keys suddenly felt heavier in my hand. I held them up, letting them jingle in the tense air. I told her plainly that I was going inside, and that was the moment everything erupted. As I reached for the door, my key slid into the lock, but it didn't turn. I tried again, slower this time, but the result was the same. The lock had been changed. That realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Someone had entered my home without my permission. Someone had replaced the locks on a property that didn't belong to them. Behind me, Marla smiled smugly, as if she had been waiting for me to discover the truth in front of everyone. Her voice dripped with triumph as she said the HOA had taken the necessary steps. Anger surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I asked her who authorized the lock change, who entered my house, and how any of this was remotely legal. She gave vague answers, carefully dodging responsibility, repeating phrases like community standards and board decision. The neighbors watching shifted nervously. Some looked guilty, others curious, and a few seemed almost entertained. I realized then that this wasn't just a confrontation. It was a spectacle, one she had orchestrated to humiliate me publicly and assert her control. Every detail, every calculated pause, pointed toward one truth. This was not accidental. I stepped back from the door, heart thudding, my mind racing through possibilities. I told Marla clearly that she had no authority to lock me out, and that the house legally belonged to me. She responded with a cold, chilling sentence that made the crowd fall silent. She said, "You don't live here anymore." The words echoed inside me, heavy and surreal. Before I could respond, she pulled out her phone, dialed a number, and announced loudly for the whole street to hear that she was calling the authorities to remove me. And that was the moment I realized the situation was about to escalate far beyond anything I had imagined. The police had not yet arrived, but the tension felt as heavy as if they were already standing beside us. Marla held her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other, pacing like a prosecutor preparing a case she desperately wanted to win. She kept glancing at me with that self-satisfied smirk, as though she believed every minute that passed brought her one step closer to victory. Meanwhile, the crowd grew. More neighbors emerged from their homes, some pretending to check their mail, others casually wandering closer. Whatever this moment was, Marla wanted witnesses. She wanted an audience for her triumph. I asked again to see the documents she claimed gave the HOA authority over my home. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal her confidence wasn't as strong as she wanted everyone to believe. Then she lifted the clipboard and held it out in front of her chest without handing it to me. From where I stood, all I could see were pages filled with bold text, highlighted lines, and signatures that looked suspiciously fresh. When I reached for the papers, she snapped them back like a child refusing to share. "You'll get these when the investigation is finished," she said. Investigation. The word alone made me laugh out loud. I demanded she explain what exactly was being investigated, and her response was almost theatrical. She straightened her back, raised her voice, and declared that multiple violations had accumulated over the past months. Violations so severe, she said, that the HOA had no choice but to intervene to protect community integrity. Every buzzword she used sounded copied from a manual she didn't fully understand. When I asked what violations she was referring to, she listed vague accusations like unauthorized activity, improper occupancy, and suspicious alterations. Nothing specific, nothing provable. I pointed out that each of those accusations required evidence. Notice, hearings, and appeals steps the HOA had completely skipped. Her cheeks tightened, and she immediately shifted tactics. She claimed the HOA had sent multiple warnings and that I had chosen not to cooperate. I felt a wave of frustration rising through me. The only notices I had received were cryptic, vague, and pointless. Certainly nothing that suggested eviction from my own home. But Marla wasn't interested in logic. She was interested in winning. And in her mind, the truth was just an accessory she could adjust whenever needed. Then she said the words that made the whole crowd stiffen. She told me the HOA had exercised its right of seizure under emergency authority. The phrase sounded official, intimidating, and terrifyingly unfamiliar. I asked her to repeat it. certain I had misheard. But she said it again, louder, as if speaking nonsense with confidence would suddenly make it legal. My neighbors whispered among themselves, confused and unsettled. Even those who supported strict HOA rules seemed unsure about what Marla was claiming. She held the clipboard tight and announced that the house was no longer mine. According to her, the community had reclaimed it. I stepped closer, closing the distance until only the clipboard separated us. I told her plainly that no, HOA has the power to seize private property, no matter what imaginary rule she thought she was following. My voice was steady, but inside, a storm was raging. She responded by lifting a single page and waving it in the air dramatically. It was stamped, signed, and clearly doctored. The date was recent, the ink too crisp, the formatting inconsistent. She refused to let me examine it, instead insisting that the board had approved it unanimously. I asked who signed it. She refused to answer. A few neighbors stepped forward now, voicing their discomfort. One asked whether the rest of the community had even been informed. Another questioned how the HOA could take action without a vote. Marla snapped back, insisting everything was done by procedure and that anyone who doubted her could attend. The next meeting, but the cracks were showing. People were beginning to see the holes in her story, the inconsistencies, the desperation behind her confidence. Still, she pushed forward, raising her voice, declaring that I was forbidden from entering the house until the transition process was complete. Transition to whom? She wouldn't say. Finally, I asked the question she had been avoiding from the beginning. I asked her why she wanted me out. Not the HOA, not the board, her. Why was she so determined to force me off my own property, her? Eyes flickered, just for a moment, revealing the truth she tried so hard to bury. She opened her mouth to answer, but at that exact moment, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. Police cars turned the corner, lights flashing. The neighbors stepped aside. Marla straightened her posture, clutching her clipboard like a trophy. She was ready to deliver her final blow, and she thought the police would help her deliver it. The moment the police cars stopped in front of my driveway, the entire atmosphere shifted. Blue and red lights washed over the houses, turning our quiet street into a stage. Neighbors who had been lingering at a distance now edged closer, eager to watch the scene unfold. Marla stepped forward with an air of victory, waving her clipboard like a badge of authority. I stood perfectly still, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. When the first officer approached, hand resting near his belt, I could feel Marla practically vibrating with anticipation. She believed this was her moment to win. The officer greeted her politely, as if he recognized her from previous calls. She immediately launched into a dramatic explanation, claiming I was refusing to leave a property I no longer had legal rights to. She described me as non-compliant, aggressive, and potentially a threat. It was shocking how easily she twisted the narrative, rehearsed and confident, as though she had practiced this speech in her bathroom mirror. The officer listened with a stern expression, nodding along. When she finished, she pointed toward me like I was a criminal she had personally hunted down. The crowd murmured uneasily. Then the officer turned toward me, his posture firm and authoritative. He asked for my name and identification in a tone that suggested I was already guilty of something. I handed him my ID without hesitation. Calmness was my only weapon. He asked if I lived here. I told him yes. He asked if I had proof. I said it was inside the house I was suddenly locked out of. That sentence alone made him pause. He glanced at Marla, then back at me. The fact that someone had changed the locks without my permission clearly unsettled him. I told him plainly that the home was mine, legally purchased and registered under my name. I explained that the HOA had no authority to seize it, lock me out, or claim otherwise. I even pointed toward the new lock, emphasizing that someone had broken into my house to install it. The officer's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the door, then at the clipboard Marla clutched so tightly. Before he asked another question, I requested to speak privately, away from the crowd. He agreed, signaling for me to walk with him across the driveway, away from the cluster of watching neighbors. I explained every detail over the past week, the vague warnings, the denied access, the unreturned emails, and finally, the unauthorized lock change. The officer listened carefully this time, no longer influenced by Marla's theatrical performance. He asked if I had any documents proving ownership. I told him most were inside the home, but I could pull up digital copies on my phone. As I scrolled through emails and mortgage documents, his skeptical posture completely faded. He could see everything lined up clearly: ownership, payments, records, all of it undeniably mine. The officer took a long breath and nodded, thanking me for the information. Then he stepped back toward Marla, and I followed. She was standing with her arms crossed, chin lifted, expecting praise for her report. Instead, the officer asked her to present the documents giving the HOA authority to lock out a homeowner. She froze for a split second, then lifted her clipboard with that same rehearsed confidence. But when he reached for the papers, she recoiled. She tried summarizing them instead of handing them over, spewing legal-sounding nonsense that made no real sense. The officer's patience wore thin. He told her plainly that he needed to see the documents, not hear interpretations of them. Her voice wavered. She flipped through the pages rapidly, searching for something convincing. I could see the fear growing behind her eyes. The officer quickly recognized what I already knew. The documents were either fake, altered, or entirely meaningless. He asked when the board voted. She dodged the question. He asked for the signatures. She covered them with her thumb. He asked why no official notice was filed with county records. She made up a rule that didn't exist. Then the officer said the words that shattered her confidence. He told her that the HOA had absolutely no authority to seize or repossess private property, and certainly no authority to prevent a lawful homeowner from entering their own home. He reminded her that performing an unauthorized lock change could be considered breaking and entering. The neighborhood fell silent. A few gasps cut through the tension. Marla's face drained of color. She tried backtracking, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the board had temporarily secured the home. But the damage was done. Her story was unraveling publicly and rapidly. Finally, the officer turned to me and said I had every legal right to access my home. He radioed for a locksmith to force the lock open if needed, and instructed Marla to step away from the property. Immediately, her expression twisted into something between rage and humiliation. She tried arguing, but he shut her down with a firm warning. She had crossed a legal line, and she knew it. As the officer stood between us, ensuring I wouldn't be interfered with again, I realized something important. This wasn't just a power struggle. It was the beginning of a larger fight, one that would expose exactly why she wanted me gone. As the officer waited for the locksmith to arrive, the crowd slowly began to thin. Some slipped back into their homes, embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Others stayed, pretending to look concerned but clearly fascinated by the unfolding drama. Marla stood several feet away, arms rigid at her sides, her lips pressed into a tight line. She looked like a queen whose crown had just slipped in front of her entire kingdom. For the first time, she wasn't speaking, not one word. That silence alone told me more than her accusations ever had. Something deeper was driving her obsession. The second officer approached me quietly, almost cautiously, as if he sensed a larger story hidden beneath the surface. He asked whether I had any disputes with the HOA before this week, any personal conflicts, any disagreements that could explain such extreme behavior. I told him everything about the sudden inspections, the vague warnings, the access denial, the hostile tone Marla had carried from the moment she became president. The officer nodded slowly, scratching his chin. He said he had been on the force long enough to know when something wasn't procedural but personal. His words sent a chill through me. As we waited, I noticed something odd. Marla's eyes weren't on me or the officers. They were fixed on my house. Not the porch, not the lock, not the door, the house itself. She stared at it with an intensity that didn't match any rule enforcement. It was almost possessive, like someone looking at something they believed should be theirs. I suddenly remembered a conversation months ago when she mentioned wanting to expand community resources and repurpose unused properties. At the time, it sounded harmless. Now, it sounded like a warning I had failed to recognize. The locksmith finally arrived. And the moment he began working on the lock, Marla snapped. Her voice cracked as she marched toward the officers, insisting they had no right to undo HOA protocol. The officer held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He reminded her that she was risking criminal charges for interfering. That only made her angrier. She pointed at my house and shouted that it wasn't supposed to go to him, the him being me. The crowd hushed instantly. She realized too late what she'd said. She tried covering her slip, but it was out, raw and revealing. I stepped forward and asked her directly what she meant. Her eyes darted from me to the officers and back again. Panic flickered across her face. She muttered something about an administrative reassignment, but even she knew how ridiculous that sounded. The officer pressed her, asking whether the HOA had attempted to claim ownership of the property for future development or financial gain. Her reaction said everything her words didn't. She didn't deny it. She didn't even attempt to. Instead, she shifted blame, insisting it was board strategy, that she was just following orders. But her trembling hands betrayed her. The lock finally clicked open. The officer stepped aside and told me I could enter my home. That simple sentence felt like reclaiming a part of my identity. But as I walked toward the door, I felt Marla's stare burning into my back, filled with resentment not because she lost a dispute, but because she lost something she wanted, something she had been planning, and now the truth was starting to bleed through her cracks. Whatever she was after, whatever reason she wanted me gone, it ran far deeper than petty HOA rules, and I knew I hadn't seen the last of her attempts. The tension in the room reached its breaking point when the HOA president planted herself between me and the officer, acting like she was the final authority on who belonged in my own home. She flipped a page in her binder with a dramatic snap, as if she were about to reveal a secret weapon that would erase me from the property entirely. The officer leaned in to read it, but even from where I stood, I could see one obvious detail. It wasn't an ownership record. It wasn't a legal document. It wasn't anything that actually mattered. It was just a printout of outdated association notes. Still, she hovered over it like it carried the force of law. Pointing at it with conviction that bordered on delusion, she cleared her throat sharply, loud enough to make sure the officer focused solely on her. "As you can see," she announced, "this home is not registered under his occupancy. He moved in early. That violates Section 9. Her voice was proud, self-satisfied. The officer tilted his head, clearly confused. He reread the page, looking for something of value, but all he found was a rule about mailbox placement from 2 years ago. Something flickered in his expression: uncertainty, maybe even annoyance, but she kept pushing. She needed him to believe this more than she needed the truth. I stepped forward, maintaining my calm even though everything inside me was rattling. "Officer, that isn't legal documentation," I said, keeping my tone steady. "It doesn't override property records or ownership transfers." She immediately spun toward me, eyes wide with offended authority. As if I had slapped the binder out of her hands, she tried to cut me off, but the officer raised a hand, stopping her for the first time. It was a small shift, barely a moment, but it broke her rhythm, and I could tell she wasn't used to being questioned. The officer asked her to produce the actual legal document backing her claims. For the first time all evening, her confidence cracked. She flipped pages, hands shaking slightly, searching for something she never had. Her voice grew firmer, louder, almost desperate. "The HOA has authority over this property," she insisted. But this time it sounded rehearsed, hollow, like she was repeating a line that had worked on everyone else until now. He waited. She couldn't produce anything. The silence that followed was heavy, embarrassing, and for her, devastating. She closed the binder slowly, the sound of the cover snapping shut echoing through the living room like a defeat she refused to acknowledge. But instead of backing down, she doubled down. "He is not approved," she spat, turning her frustration toward me. "He didn't get clearance. This is trespassing." The officer's eyebrows rose. The word trespassing clearly pushed things into new territory. He stepped back toward me and asked for identification and any proof I had available. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the documents I'd brought home earlier, and placed them on the counter. He scanned them carefully, taking his time, flipping. them under the house's overhead light. Each second felt like a long, suspended breath. The HOA president hovered behind him, trying to peek at the papers, hoping to find anything that would give her an edge. When he finally finished reading, he straightened and looked at both of us. His tone had changed, firmer, clearer. "These documents show he has rightful access to this property," he said. The words hit her like a slap. She lunged forward, insisting that her records held more weight, insisting that her authority superseded everything. But the officer held up a hand again, stopping her mid-sentence. For the first time, she had no control over the narrative in the room. She froze, breathing heavily, like she was processing the fact that she hadn't just lost an argument, she had lost her power. Her eyes darted around the room, scanning for an escape, but pride kept her rooted in place. She wasn't going down quietly, not her. Not the woman who built her personality around enforcing rules that didn't exist. Then came the moment that shifted everything. She pointed at me, voice trembling with rage, and screamed, "If he stays here tonight, the HOA will take legal action against both of you." The threat was wild, reckless, and completely empty, but it echoed through the room like a final attempt to claw back control. The officer stepped toward her, slow, deliberate, and lowered his voice. "Ma'am, HOA rules do not override ownership rights. You cannot remove someone from their property." His tone was calm, but the meaning was a direct blow to everything she had stood on. Her mouth fell open slightly. Her hands tightened around her binder. Her face turned a shade of red, so deep it bordered on purple. Her humiliation filled the room like heat. She tried one last tactic, shifting into victim mode. "I was just trying to protect the community," she whispered, as if I were the villain. The officer didn't buy it. He didn't move. He didn't soften. He simply told her she had overstepped, and she needed to leave the property immediately. Her eyes flicked to me, angry, wounded, vengeful. She wasn't finished. I could feel it. This wasn't the end for her. People like her don't retreat. They regroup. She marched to the doorway. With quick, sharp steps, as if each footstep was an insult, she hurled back at us. She slammed the door so hard behind her that the picture frames on the wall rattled. Silence settled in. The officer turned to me, his expression shifting from authority to something more human. "You handled that better than most people would," he said quietly. I nodded, but inside, something deep was awakening, a resolve, a quiet fury. Because tonight wasn't just about proving I belonged in my own home. It was about exposing exactly how far the HOA president was willing to go to push me out, to control me, to erase me. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was planning her next attack, and I would be ready for it. The morning after, the confrontation felt almost surreal. Sunlight poured into my living room, illuminating every corner of a space I had feared losing. My keys were still in my hand, the lock untouched since the locksmith's arrival. The neighborhood seemed quieter, subdued, as if everyone had spent the night processing what had happened. Marla's absence was glaring. She hadn't returned to her usual spots, her usual walks, or her smug inspections. The air carried a sense of anticipation, like everyone was waiting to see how the dominoes would fall after her public defeat. News of the confrontation spread quickly. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, recounting the previous night's events as if it were some dramatic television episode. Some expressed sympathy, others guilt for silently watching her antics escalate. Slowly, the narrative shifted. Marla was no longer the authority figure she had pretended to be. Her credibility had crumbled in front of everyone, replaced by awkward silence and uncomfortable glances. I watched as her carefully crafted persona, built on intimidation and manipulation, began to unravel. It was an eerie feeling, empowering, yes, but also a reminder of just how close I had been to losing everything. Legal counsel quickly confirmed what the officers had already indicated. Marla and the HOA had overstepped multiple laws, unauthorized. Lock changes, false claims of property seizure, and harassment could all carry serious penalties. With this leverage, I was able to push for immediate corrective action. The board, shaken by the public humiliation and the threat of legal consequences, convened a special meeting. The decision was unanimous. Marla was removed as president. her influence stripped away faster than she could protest. It was shocking how swiftly the tables had turned, but necessary to restore order and fairness. The repercussions didn't stop. With her removal, investigations revealed she had manipulated records, falsified documents, and tried to coerce neighbors into supporting her fabricated claims. Penalties followed: fines, legal warnings, and public censure. Her reputation, once a symbol of supposed authority, was now tarnished beyond repair. Even the neighbors who had initially remained silent were forced to confront the reality. The woman they had feared was entirely responsible for the chaos. Watching her attempts at intimidation backfire so completely was almost poetic, a form of justice that no legal action alone could provide. Community meetings shifted dramatically after the incident. Rules were clarified, HOA authority was limited, and oversight was increased. Neighbors began participating actively, learning from the spectacle they had witnessed. It became clear that the HOA no longer held the power to manipulate or threaten residents. A sense of unity grew among us, a feeling that had been missing for months. I noticed people greeting me again, smiling genuinely, and discussing neighborhood concerns openly. The change wasn't just about the removal of one person, it was about reclaiming control, transparency, and respect for property rights. Personally, the experience left a lasting mark. I learned the depth of determination and courage required to stand up to authority when that authority is abusing its power. I also learned to trust my instincts, to notice the subtle signs of escalation before they explode into full-blown crises. The ordeal strengthened my resolve. I became more vigilant, more strategic, and more confident in protecting my rights. It was a lesson in resilience, one written not in textbooks, but in lived experience, filled with tension, fear, and eventual triumph. As I sit now in my living room, reflecting on everything, the house feels more like mine than ever. Every corner, every wall, every sound carries a victory that isn't just about legal ownership, it's about reclaiming respect, dignity, and peace of mind. The HOA president may have planned to humiliate me, control me, and erase my existence in this community, but the story ended differently. Karma had its way, justice had its moment, and I, standing firm with the law and my resolve, had reclaimed what was always rightfully mine. The dust finally settled, but the lessons lingered long after. Living through the ordeal with the HOA revealed more than just the limits of authority. It revealed the importance of knowing your rights and standing firm. Too often, people accept intimidation, vague rules, and overreach as a normal part of life. I had a choice: to step aside, to let fear decide my actions, or to stand my ground and demand justice. Choosing the latter changed everything. It wasn't just about property, it was about dignity, self-respect, and the refusal to be silenced or erased. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how subtle the buildup to such conflicts can be. Small notes, minor warnings, vague rules, these are often the first signs of manipulation and power abuse. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It allows the threat to grow. Early recognition is critical. Every homeowner, every resident, and every individual with rights should be vigilant. Trust your instincts when something feels off. If I hadn't noticed the subtle escalation, I might not have been prepared for the confrontation, and the consequences could have been far worse. Standing up to authority isn't easy, and it isn't painless. There were moments of fear, doubt, and overwhelming frustration. There were neighbors whispering, others doubting me, and the sheer weight of seeing someone claim power over what was mine. Yet, it was precisely in those moments that resilience mattered most. Remaining calm, presenting facts, and letting evidence speak louder than threats made all the difference. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet insistence that you belong, that you are right, and that no one, even an HOA president, has the power to override truth and justice. The aftermath of the confrontation changed the community in unexpected ways. Transparency replaced secrecy, collaboration replaced fear, and people began paying attention to governance rather than blindly obeying authority. Witnessing the collapse of someone who abused their power served as a stark reminder: manipulation and intimidation eventually crumble when challenged intelligently and persistently. The experience transformed neighbors from passive observers into engaged participants. It taught everyone that accountability matters, that justice isn't just a word, and that collective vigilance can protect not just one person, but an entire community. For anyone watching this story, there's a message that goes beyond the drama of an HOA conflict. Life will present situations where rules are manipulated, power is abused, or individuals try to control what is rightfully yours. Knowledge, preparation, and courage are your strongest allies. Document everything, understand your rights, and never allow intimidation to silence you. The world may test you, but it cannot override what is lawful, what is just, and what is yours by right. Standing firm is never just a personal victory, it's a lesson to everyone around you. As I sit in my home today, the keys in my hand, the sunlight streaming across the floor, I feel a profound sense of ownership, not just of the property, but of my ability to protect what matters. The ordeal was terrifying, exhausting, and unfair, but it also proved something vital. When you know your rights, when you remain calm and strategic, and when you refuse to be bullied, you can turn even the most daunting challenge into a triumph. The HOA may have tried to erase me, but instead, I stood taller, stronger, and wiser than ever before.